was by providing cheap credit, was by providing debt to those very people who couldn't really afford things anymore. So they kept buying. And when it collapses, it's those same people that have to pay once again, even though in many ways they were the victims the first time around.
As a result of the crises, the Bank of England has bought corporate debt and repackaged it at lower rates of interest. Yet the average person is being asked to pay more than ever to borrow on overdrafts and credit cards.
Debts between the very wealthy or between governments can always be renegotiated and always have been throughout world history. They're not anything set in stone. It's generally speaking when you have debts owed by the poor to the rich that suddenly debts become a sacred obligation, more important than anything else. The idea of renegotiating them becomes unthinkable.
Can you pin down exactly what would keep investors happy, make them feel more confident?
That's a tough one. Personally, it doesn't matter. See, I'm a trader. I don't really care about that kind of stuff.
Were you born in England?
If I see an opportunity to make money, I go with that. So, for most traders, we don't really care that much how they're going to fix the economy, how they're going to fix the whole situation. Our job is to make money from it. And personally, I've been dreaming of this moment for 3 years. If you know what to do, you can make a lot of money from this. I have a confession, which is I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. I dream of another moment like this. I dream of another recession. I dream of another moment like this. You can make a lot of money from this.
Bruno, Virginia hurt somebody real bad. You ought to hate her.
The way in which you can look across Europe now and see that the new Prime Minister of Greece, not elected, essentially imposed, Papademos, former employee of Goldman Sachs, the new Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Italy, Mario Monti, former employee of Goldman Sachs, the new President of the European Central Bank, former employee of Goldman Sachs. It's quite, you kind of see these people popping up absolutely everywhere.
That's the way to change what we have. Take all power and all freedoms away from the people and collect everything into the hands of one small group with absolute power.
From the people, without the people, against the people.
What's been interesting out of all this, I suppose, is the question of democracy that's been opened up very starkly in Europe, that you have a government of bankers essentially imposed on you. It's bankers who more or less got us into this mess, to put it rather crudely, but that's a good first approximation to it. And then you say, OK, bankers are the people who are therefore going to get us out of it, and incidentally they're going to run your country now. There's a serious question of democracy that's opened up here.
By the way, the banking crisis drove more than 100 million people back into poverty. The mortality statistics of people who go into poverty rise hugely for a whole range of reasons. So the banking crisis isn't just about becoming poorer, it was about killing people as well. And guess what? We haven't really got to the bottom of it. We never held anybody to account, and we haven't done the radical reforming job that we really needed to do, because we mistakenly thought if we destabilise the position any further, it'll make matters worse. And guess who took the decisions? All the people who were there in the first place.
I think you ought to know that the business of one of these businessmen is murder.
Their weapons are modern, their thinking 2,000 years out of date.
Look, I was there when the Secretary and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve came those days and talked with members of Congress about what was going on. It was about September 15th. Here's the facts, and we don't even talk about these things. On Thursday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two. The Treasury opened up its window to help They pumped $105 billion in the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic out there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours the world economy would have collapsed.
When money is withdrawn internationally from one currency to another, the reserve currency shifts from the national bank of one country to the reserve account of the foreign bank. Foreign banks have relationships with local banks that allow them to hold foreign reserve currencies whilst not being a part of the central bank scheme at the local central bank. For example, when £1,000 is transferred into euros, a UK bank will agree an exchange rate with a euro area bank, perhaps 1.15 euros to the pound. The UK bank will then transfer £1,000 of the central reserve currency to the UK partner bank of the European bank, whilst the European bank will transfer 1,150 euros of reserve currency to the European partner bank of the UK bank.
What happens when currencies and the exchange rate system is no longer managed? What are some of the first consequences? Devaluations, speculation, imbalances, where some countries would accrue more and more and more. What? What would they accrue? Other currencies. Other currencies.
The reserve currency needs to be spent in the country of origin, or exchanged into other currencies. Most foreign banks do not have deposit-taking accounts outside of their national borders, and as such, the foreign reserves they hold do not come back to them in the form of deposits. When a country accumulates trade imbalances, it either accumulates foreign reserve currencies, in the case of surplus, or spends its own reserves, in the case of negative trade balances.
Balance of trade is basically the difference between what you're selling abroad and what you're buying from abroad. Now, the feature on the UK is that for a very long period of time it's had a deficit on something called a visible balance of trade, which is trade in things, well, things that you can see. So that is goods that you'd recognise, stuff you can put in containers, it's cars, computers, things that you'd see in a shop. That's been in substantial deficit for, I think it opened up did open up in the early 1980s. And essentially it hasn't gone away since, and if anything has got wider and wider.
Foreign exchange reserves cannot be directly used for domestic spending. The money can only be spent abroad, or on imports. A country with a large balance of trade deficit relies on its creditors to spend the imbalances accrued in its own market.
I mean, there have been proposals in the past to try and create a mechanism for those imbalances to match up. So Keynes, for instance, John Maynard Keynes, at the end of the Second World War, his original proposal for what became Bretton Woods and a set of institutions set up there, like the IMF and the World Bank, was that there would be a kind of international clearing union. This is particularly relating to the trade side rather than the sort of the financial side directly. But the principle was that, you know, once trade balances had opened up, everybody would bank through an international clearing bank, and that would kind of force everyone to eventually reconcile the imbalances that appeared in the real economy.
But no such mechanism exists. The accumulated net trade imbalance for the UK is around £800 billion.
In essence, what has happened is that over many years, some countries have had big trade surpluses and others big trade deficits. The countries with trade deficits have been spending more than they've been earning, so they've had to borrow from abroad. And they've been doing this year after year. Countries like that are the United States, ourselves, and some other countries in Europe. That cannot go on. And there are two ways in which this can come to an end. Either, and we're seeing this in some other countries in Europe, if they can't find new ways to become competitive, then their ability to repay the debts is called into question. Another way of doing it, which we followed, is that we've got a credible plan to repay our debts, and the value of sterling has fallen by 25% to make our exports more competitive and attractive to overseas buyers, and it to be more attractive for British consumers to buy from British producers rather than overseas producers. That is what we have done to put in place a framework to rebalance our economy, and I'm sure that's the right way to do it.
Currency war, also known as competitive devaluation, is a condition where countries compete against each other to achieve a relatively low exchange rate for their currency. As the price to buy a particular currency falls, so too does the real price of exports from that country. Domestic industry receives a boost in demand, both at home and abroad.
It's made British exports appear rather cheaper, so they've kind of recovered a little bit, but because the rest of the world is now looking really quite ropey, they've started to fall back down again. So what we're looking at is something that almost a kind of anarchy, and in a way, the increasing anarchy. This is what's happened over the last few years, where the Brazilian finance minister has been most vocal about this, talking about currency wars, talking about the desire of national governments when confronted by a major recession. They think if we could export more, we could dig ourselves out of this recession. If we want to export more, we depreciate our currency. That makes our goods cheaper, everyone else buys them, we'll all be better off. Now, the issue here is that if you depreciate, it's like everybody else appreciates against you. Their stuff becomes more expensive, so they're not too happy about that. They also want to depreciate, and this is where you can see a competitive round of devaluations breaking out.
To decrease the value of its national currency, a national central bank sells reserve currency into the market. It creates this currency out of nothing by typing numbers into a computer. During the long phase of commodity money, the exchange rate would depend on the amount of gold, silver, or copper contained in the coins of each country. Similarly, after the advent of paper money and the gold standard, the exchange rate depended on the amount of gold a government promised to pay the holder of the banknotes. These amounts did not vary greatly in the short term, and as such, exchange rates between currencies were relatively stable. After the Second World War, currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was backed by gold. This system came to an end in 1971.
So, we have a modern financial system where money is now chaotically organized. There is no exchange rate because there's no gold standard system to sustain. So we don't need it. In fact, we believe the market will resolve all of the problems of exchange. Whether your currency should be worth more than mine is a reflection of your economy relative to mine. And if that changes, the currency and the exchange rate can change. And if we need that to happen, it'll happen magically by the efficiency of market and profit seeking, and you guys know the rest, I think.
A currency's value in relation to another currency is determined by the market. If more people want to buy a currency than sell it, its value increases. If more people want to sell, its value decreases. The value is set by individual banks. As they buy and sell currencies, they will adjust the exchange rate.
In the last study I read, in 2007, each day on currency markets, $3.2 trillion are traded each day. Who knows what the global GDP is? 50. Again, Brucey, higher. 60, that's closer. The point is, think about that exchange happening every single day. There's about 260 business days a year. It takes a few weeks to match the global value of every economic transaction that happens everywhere, every day, in a year. And it takes a few weeks.
Obviously, all of us trade currency fairly regularly. If you go abroad, you exchange into another currency. That's a form of currency trading. You're swapping your pounds into whatever, euros or yen or whatever it might be. That happens fairly regularly, and that's a conventional part of the trading process. Now, large corporations have to do this on a regular basis. Where it becomes something that people question, and where you get people saying, well, hang on, this is speculation, is when you get people realising that currencies move around next to each other. And if they move around in value next to each other, there's always an opportunity to try and make money out of those changes in value, and therefore you can speculate on it. And that's the more sort of questionable end of the market. That's the bit of the market that things like a financial transactions tax would try and chop away at. Because the assumption there, and it's kind of not incorrect, is that this just produces instability for everyone else. That these people want volatility in the market because that's how they make their money. They want to encourage it, and they do encourage it by trading and speculating in the way that they do.
By 2010, the foreign exchange market had grown to be the largest and most liquid market in the world, with an average of $4 trillion of currency being exchanged every day.
Volatility creates a need. What does it do to countries, especially perhaps small ones like developing countries, if there are suddenly huge and instantly fluctuating financial flows? What do they have to do to cope?
Their production of the products that they're selling on the
Increase their production and sell more, lowering the price, and becoming possibly even poorer.
Once you start talking about the international system, it becomes really quite a peculiar thing, in that a lot of it depends on simply sentiment and beliefs about what an economy is like, rather more than it depends on anything the economy might or might not actually be doing. And that can shift very, very rapidly, because if it's just somebody's belief about a currency is supportable, then they can carry on believing this until whenever. If that belief changes, and can change very rapidly in a financial market, the process of financial contagion can take place in just minutes, seconds even, that you can just move from being apparently quite a stable, robust economy to being one that suddenly sentiment has turned against you, and you find that markets are picking on you. And it can often be not much more than you're simply a next door neighbour of a country that's currently in trouble.
Many of the world's financial crises in the past 30 years have been caused by rapid withdrawals of the nation's currency or the currencies of an entire region. This type of activity is often referred to as financial warfare.
It's benefited major institutions really quite substantially. Goldman Sachs, for example, or any large bank, has done somewhat better out of this set of arrangements than it would have done in a far more regulated environment. It's made people very, very wealthy. It's allowed financial markets to expand absolutely enormously. Anybody involved in that is keen on seeing a deregulated world. In the case of the UK, you have a government which has been quite overtly and deliberately and aggressively arguing against any forms of regulation being imposed on those financial markets. But it's not the case that someone's behind the scenes pulling the strings. It's that this is how the thing works, quite deliberately, quite overtly in front of you. That's the world as it is. It's making some people very rich. They're quite happy with it.
I think it is a form of economic warfare. Much of the change in the way that the global economy works over the last 30 years result from this debt, this third world debt, because it's given rich countries and banks and the financial sector enormous amounts of power and control over the poorer bits of the world where a lot of the resources are that we like using. And that's been used in a way that many people have compared to a form of colonialism. I mean, it's a very real, direct form of power that's been used over those countries to force those countries to do what are really in the interests of the richest segments of the world that they do. And as a result of that, not only have corporations become absolutely, made huge amounts of profits and become absolutely enormous and all pervasive, but the financial sector has become even bigger than that. And the real money in the world to be made today is not by producing anything at all. It's simply by forms of speculating, basically making money from money. That's the most profitable and by far and away the biggest form of activity, of economic activity that exists in the world today.
To protect themselves, vulnerable countries need to accrue currency from rich countries who create these currencies out of nothing.
The Netherlands' first Governor-General of Indonesia, the man who built the trade routes, fortified them. What I mean by that is built forts along them and fought Spanish fleets and British fleets, said about the development of the Netherlands Empire and Netherlands trade was, "We cannot make trade without war, nor war without trade." Money and power. So reserves have become the way in which you can insure yourself against what? Speculation. You said speculation. Speculative attack. Fall in the market. Bubbles.
When a country succumbs to a speculative attack, it is asked to deregulate its markets and conform its financial system to that of the dominant party.
The big problem that's faced by most developing countries who got into a debt crisis was that they were told by the powers that be in the world, the International Monetary Fund, which is in many ways governs the global financial system, that the way to get out of debt actually is first of all to restructure your economy, especially to increase your exports so you're earning more dollars, and then you can pay off your debt, which is normally in dollars or some other foreign currency. Unfortunately, time and time again that was proved to not be the case at all. Actually, countries cut back their public spending to the bone, so they stopped growing, they stopped having any potential for growth, and what they did produce was aimed at the export market, was aimed at creating dollars and so on. So they were paying off their debts, but they weren't developing their own economy at all. They were paying far, far, far more in debt repayments than they were spending on health or education or anything else, and their debts just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
The country becomes a vassal state, allowing large corporations